Hi. Today we're going to be talking with Dr. Phillip Resnick, who is a professor of psychiatry and a forensic psychiatrist and one of the most well-known psychiatrists in the country in his field, and we'll be discussing various cases that have been in the news and also a number of cases that he's contributed to, so stay with us. Hi, I wanted to welcome you to the show today, Dr. Resnick. Thank you so much for joining us from Ohio.
Sure.
I have a lot of questions for you, and I think there have been a lot of cases in the news recently and cases that you've been involved in that I think you can help my audience understand a little bit better, and that I'm hoping today that while you're with us that everybody will learn a little bit more about what you do and also get a context for some of the news and different cases, criminal cases that we've been seeing in the news. And my first question is, you were asked, and you actually did an evaluation of the Cleveland kidnapper, Ariel Castro. And when you did this evaluation, I guess first I'd ask you to speak to what was the nature of your evaluation. And then I wanted to speak to, or ask you about whether or not, or how, if you find a defendant like an Ariel Castro to be sane for trial, how you reconcile that with some of the remarks he made during his own sentencing. So first of all, let me just ask you, what were you asked to do in the Ariel Castro case by the prosecutors?
I was actually asked by the court, and the issue was his competence to stand trial. And that's a rather straightforward test, whether he understands the proceedings and is able to assist his attorney. And in this case, it was a pretty straightforward evaluation, but I think the judge just wanted to get to make a record so there would be no basis for appeal, to be very clear that he was competent, and he was. When I did see him, he was eager to tell his story in a self-serving way, which he then did publicly at a sentencing hearing.
And is that some form of mental disease or defect when you see somebody, it's a self-serving way that he told a story, but he said things along the lines of that the victims enjoyed having sex with him and that one of them was a virgin when they were kidnapped, and I guess to the lay person that comes off as being out of touch with reality, the reality of the situation. But how does that play out as a psychiatrist and an expert as you are in your field? I mean, what are we as the public to glean from those types of pronouncements when we hear someone speaking like him at trial?
Well, first, anyone who the public views as a monster doesn't view themselves as a monster. Based on their life experience, they feel justified in what they do. So, for example, homosexual pedophiles want to justify what they're doing. They don't want to believe they're harming children. And there's a national organization called the Man-Boy Love Society that seeks to get state legislatures to reduce the age of consent to age 6 for sex between an adult and a child. So that's just an example of, they have a drive toward children, they want to justify it, they don't want to believe they're harming anyone, and this is called a cognitive distortion. And Castro was an example of strong cognitive distortions, but it's not a mental disease.
Okay, and then we also talked briefly when we were chatting on the phone about the fact, and there's also publications where you were quoted as saying that when you evaluated Mr. Castro, that you didn't find him to be suicidal. He later reportedly, hung himself in jail and killed himself. I'm curious, because there are a lot of conspiracy theorists that sort of felt that something else had happened there and that maybe somebody had, the guards or somebody else had a hand in his suicide, in conjunction with your remarks that you had found him not to be suicidal. Could you explain if there was some way that he could have from the moment you evaluated him to the moment that he ended up killing himself, if the circumstantial change of him being finally in prison may have changed that evaluation to you, to him wanting to be suicidal. Were there changes in what was happening to him that made the evaluation, your evaluation, not current at the time that he killed himself?
Sure. Well, first of all, since I evaluated him, a letter dated in 2004 surfaced in his home showing that he did actually consider suicide at that time. When I asked him about it, he said that he wasn't suicidal, and he seemed to be simply accepting of a life in prison. However, no one knows what happened in prison, whether other inmates threatened him, how the guards treated him. So I have no idea what new circumstances may have caused him to take his life.
When you sit down with somebody like an Ariel Castro and you have to evaluate them, do you affect the demeanor of like non-judgment when you're talking to them? Are you acting, trying to establish some sort of friendly kind of relationship? How do you, what's the demeanor that you walk into that sort of an examination with? I mean, and how does it play out? Because I've always been curious about that, because the rest of the world is calling him a monster, and yet you have to go in there and somehow connect with him in order to get the information that you need to get. So how do you speak to him? What is your demeanor?
Sure. Again, I approach him neutrally, fairly, non-judgmentally, and it's sincere. And of course, once you've evaluated several hundred murderers, you don't have the intensity of emotion. Sometimes I'll have a trainee with me who's sitting down with their first murderer or first rapist, and they're having a lot more emotions than I am, simply because of my experience.
So, sorry. So it's in essence, you end up training yourself to be able to control if you are having those emotions, or you're not even having them anymore. I mean, when you go in, it's actually, you're coming from a place of neutrality.
Right. No, I'm not having them anymore. And like the different roles of people makes a difference in how they perceive things. If you're a prosecutor, you have contact with the victims and you see the perpetrator as very evil. If you're a defense attorney or a psychiatrist and you sit down and spend more time with perpetrators than victims, and you hear their life story and how they may have been abused as children or what have you, you don't develop the same kind of intense anger or feelings that I think the lay public would.
Well, that's interesting. Well, let me switch gears, and I wanted to ask you, you've done a tremendous amount of work and written quite a bit about mothers that end up killing their children. And over your, I guess, your entire career, you've worked on at least 40 to 60 cases involving parents who killed their children. And you were actually a consultant to the defense in the Susan Smith case. This is just really so that my audience has a sense of the extensive nature of your expertise in this area. And you also testified for the defense in the Andrea Yates case. We actually had on Park Dietz here, who went the other way on the and felt that she was in fact sane and able to be tried. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about this area, because there have been a lot of cases in the news about parents killing their children at various different ages. Anything from a woman named Julia Powers, who was 50, a mother of two, who killed both her 13-year-old son and her 16-year-old daughter, saying that the son had mouthed off, and she ended up shooting both of them, to somebody like Andrea Yates, who had children that were a variety of ages, but younger, toddlers, and I wanted to ask you, what kind of a parent ends up killing their own children? And are there, and speaking, I guess I should speak of mothers at this point, because that's what I wanted to focus on first. Are there certain characteristics of that type of parent, of that type of woman, that generally are found when you're looking at women who have killed their children?
First, there's no single profile. I've actually divided women who kill their children into 5 separate categories, and I'm glad to discuss that. But they don't all fit a single profile. They may have very different murders. Some simply don't want their children and they kill them to get them out of the way. Others, like Andrea Yates, are severely depressed, psychotically depressed, and altruistically kill their children at what I call murder out of love rather than murder out of hate, where they genuinely believe they're doing the children a favor and having them enter heaven rather than remain on earth, which they see through their own depressed eyes as a terribly cruel world.
And some of the other categories are?
Yes, another category, which is relatively infrequent but dramatic, is called spouse revenge. This tends to come up either in custody cases or after one spouse is unfaithful. The most dramatic case that I have encountered is a man from Indianapolis. He was engaged to a woman. The woman went on a Caribbean cruise with a friend that she'd signed up before she got engaged. And the man had his mother die while his fiancée was on the cruise. He called her and asked her to please come home and be with him in his time of great upset. She said, "You know, I spent a lot of money on this cruise and declined to come home." He made up his mind at that time that he was going to make her suffer the way he was suffering. So he deliberately went on to marry her. They had a child together named Tyler. He waited until his wife was strongly bonded, and when the child was 7 months old, killed the child to make her suffer.
Wow. And are there instances where if somebody's going through a divorce, I mean, let's just focus on that because that is a big, I mean, we do see that in a lot of different news stories. I mean, that tend to, it's something that seems rather common because it's one of the types of stories that are followed a lot by the media. When that happens, is if you're in a particularly contentious dispute and there are threats like that made, is that something that people should generally take very seriously, or is that the anomaly in that type of situation?
It is the anomaly, but a couple of cases that I've seen is when the wife believes her husband has molested the children, and then there's a custody fight. And if the father has access to the children, the mother may believe, rather than the children suffering further sexual humiliation, that they're better off dead. So that's kind of a mixture of protecting the children and getting to the husband.
I have to say that when Dr. Dietz was on our show, he gave a fairly cogent and somewhat convincing argument for having found Andrea Yates to be sane enough for trial. Where was it exactly that the two of you particularly or specifically differed, and what was it that you told the court in terms of Ms. Yates' sanity?
Sure. Let me just clarify that it wasn't sane for trial. The issue was she legally insane, meaning was she culpable, was she guilty or not guilty by reason of insanity. That's where Dr. Dietz and I differed. And Dr. Dietz and I agreed on 3 central issues. We both agreed that Mrs. Yates had a severe mental disease. We both agreed that she knew what she was doing was against the law. And we both agreed that she did what she did in a belief that she was doing what was best for her children. But we interpreted those facts somewhat differently. Dr. Dietz viewed her as knowing what she did was morally wrong and against society's view and God's view. In my own assessment of her, Mrs. Yates had delusions that if she did not take her children before the age of accountability, which she put at about age 10, the children were 6 months to 7 years old, she believed that they would end up in hell, that one of her sons would become a serial murderer, one of her sons would become a mute homosexual prostitute, and she had these terrible delusions about how all her children would come to no good. And as a deeply religious woman, it was more important to her that her children were with God in heaven for all eternity rather than living their life on earth. And although she expected to be executed, she loved her children, was willing to sacrifice her own life and her afterlife, even if she went to hell, as long as she could allow her children to be with God rather than in hell.
Did you, in making that evaluation, and I saw you teaching about, there's a clip on the internet of you teaching and sort of going through the different steps of her marriage and talking about her husband. Did you speak with her husband? I mean, there was always this sense in I think amongst a lot of people in the country that how is it possible that the husband didn't pick up on what was happening with his wife? And that in some ways he was partly responsible. And I'm curious what your take was on not the legal role that he played, because we all know that she was responsible for that, but the role, if any, that he might have had in the deaths of those children by not paying attention to what was happening with his wife. Or was it not obvious?
Sure. The public was very, very down on Rusty. People hated him. And in fact, there were hundreds of letters to the prosecutor saying you should try Rusty Yates. I did speak more than once with Rusty Yates. I went out to the home with him. He showed me the bathtub and so forth where the children were drowned. And I think he gets somewhat of a bad rap. It turns out that Mrs. Yates was under psychiatric care. In fact, she was seen by her treating psychiatrist less than 48 hours before she drowned her children. She denied suicidality. She denied homicidality. And if a board-certified psychiatrist could not foresee that she was a risk, I don't think it's fair to say that her husband should have foreseen it. It's not as if he didn't know that she was severely depressed. She was in treatment. So I don't think that he should have had any better ability to foresee it.
And something that's a really interesting clarification, because I don't think that's widely known by the public. My other question would be with regards to Susan Smith, and I guess she falls into that category, and I might be wrong here because it's based on reports that I read, and it's better to have you right here to ask the question of, but the reports indicated that or the idea from the prosecution was that she was trying to get rid of her children so that she could have a life with the boyfriend. Did she fall into that category as far as you were concerned, of mothers that kill their children? And what was your assessment of her?
Sure. I spent more than 8 hours with Susan Smith. And although the public was informed by the media of the version you just stated, that was not her version. Her version, which I gave credence to, was that she was indeed in love with a man. He let her know that day, the day of the drownings, that he was not going to see her further. And she accepted it as a loss. She decided to kill herself. She thought about how the children would make out with her separated husband, who she did not rate very highly. She decided that all three of them should die. She thought about driving into a bridge abutment, then decided to drive them into the lake. As she drove down toward the lake, she lost her nerve at the last minute, jumped out of the car, and the children went in the lake. Then she did a terrible thing. She lied, said a black man had kidnapped her, and so forth. But her account, which was substantiated by the boyfriend, was not that she was trying to make herself more attractive. A little interesting sidelight on that was Susan Smith told me how she confessed. The police chief lied to her and said, Susan, you told us that you were carjacked at a particular spot, and we had cameras rolling because there were a lot of drug buys there. We've now checked the videotape, and we know it didn't happen that way. What really happened? And at that point, Susan Smith confessed and said that she had driven into the lake. And a few hours later, she saw the police chief and said, is it true that you really had cameras there? And he said no. So that was actually how they got the confession out of her.
And as any devotee of law and order will know, or also any lawyer, the police are allowed to lie to obtain a confession, although sometimes it gives the rest of us pause for thought in terms of the fairness of that. But nonetheless, that is the law. Let me move on, and I wanted to talk to you about a recent spat. I mean, and again, and we were actually just, again, discussing this right before the show started, but there have been a number of stories recently about husbands killing wives and wives killing husbands. And I think particularly there is a case that is that just was in a preliminary hearing of Bob Bashara, who apparently hired a hitman to kill his wife. And then there is a newlywed murder where a wife allegedly pushed her husband off the side of a cliff in Montana 8 days after they were wed. Again, we're only hearing bits and pieces. There have been no trials yet. We haven't heard from the defense. So, I mean, we still, on this show, take that with a grain of salt until we actually hear what the actual facts are. But there is one fact that is undeniable, and that is that these various spouses, somebody somehow got in altercations where one of them ended up dead, or at least not so much in the Bashara case, but in other cases where there's direct physical contact, or the police could say that the two of them were together, or somebody has admitted they were with them and they might have another reason. But nonetheless, what is it that makes one spouse want to kill another spouse in lieu of what would seem more logical, getting a divorce? I mean, it seems to me, and something that it's kind of fascinating, it fascinates the viewers of this show, what is the psychological makeup that makes somebody think that that is the easier way to free themselves? Or, I mean, again, I'm guessing here, so I'm asking you, why do these husbands and wives, in many cases, in the cases that you're familiar with, end up killing each other or killing their spouse rather than going for something that is quite possible, like an actual legal separation?
Well, men, of course, kill their wives much more often than women kill their husbands. And men often have a sense of proprietary ownership of their wife and children. So, for example, there's a phenomenon called familicide, that is the wiping out of a family, and 95% of that is done by men. If a woman decides to take her own life and she has young children, she may kill the children and herself and leave the husband alone. But many men, if they decide to wipe out the family, they'll take their wife out. But in more conflicted marriages, that sense of proprietary ownership is that I'm not going to let this woman leave me. And it's often at the point that women are leaving that they're killed, sometimes when they're literally packing their bags and the husband realizes they mean business. Another interesting fact is that of all men who kill their wives, 1/3 go on to kill themselves. And so if you think about it, let's say a man finds his wife is leaving him for another man, and he says, I can't go on without her. He holds the gun to his own head, and then he thinks, why should I lie 6 feet under the ground while my wife lies in the arm of another man? And decides he's going to kill her and then kill himself. Often, again, men have a kind of a dependent relationship, where the controlling relationship. They view their whole self-esteem based on their relationship, and the humiliation and shame of not being able to control their wife causes them to feel that they just can't put up with it and will go on to kill that wife if she tries to leave.
Now, I know that you also evaluated Scott Peterson for the defense. Was he somebody, I mean, this is a bit of a different circumstance where he was the philanderer, he had the pregnant wife, and I guess this is one of those situations where I thought to myself, why not just divorce her if you want to carry on with a mistress or a couple of mistresses? What was your takeaway from that situation?
Yes, the reason I was employed was that the defense had done some focus groups, and they realized that Peterson's appearances on television, he did not show appropriate emotion when he talked about his wife being kidnapped. So they had a theory that maybe he had post-traumatic stress disorder, which causes psychic numbing. So they asked me to see him, and I spent several hours with him. I was not helpful to the defense. What I learned was that Mr. Peterson, had had a number of affairs. He did not admit killing his wife to me, but my speculation is he simply wanted it all. He had a new girlfriend. He did not want to have to pay for child support. This doesn't come from his own mouth, but I think that, again, he just did not have the empathic, caring about his wife, where he simply wanted to serve his own interests.
And if, I mean, looking at a situation like Scott Peterson, it sort of makes me wonder, there is always a sort of a backseat driver in the media that always looks at somebody who is suffering a loss and evaluates whether or not their response is appropriate. Is there, in fact, an appropriate response for the loss of a child or the loss of a spouse? I mean, you see this a lot on, say, HLN with Nancy Grace or something, where she'll comment on, does that seem to be a mother who is grieving? Does she seem too cold? I'm curious, since as a psychiatrist and an expert in dealing with people oftentimes that either accused of killing somebody or have suffered great loss, is there a certain way that you expect them to behave?
First of all, there's a gender difference. Women are much more in touch with their emotions than men are. And as a matter of fact, after the loss of a child, divorce is very common because of different grieving styles and anger among the couple. But there is no single pattern. In fact, when Mr. Yates was on television discussing his loss, some people viewed him as not showing enough emotion. But he was an engineer, and we don't expect the same degree of emotion in engineers that we expect of other people.
Okay. But is there, so given the gender difference, once we've established that, it sort of reminds me of cases where different attorneys have to coach if somebody's going to take the stand and that they're supposed to act a certain way. If you go in to interview somebody, and this certainly happened, I've seen it when Jodi Arias was on the stand, and is it a crocodile tears? Is she really upset about or remorseful? Is there something that you're looking for, even say if we take the gender difference out of it, we just look at just women? Is there an appropriate response to, is there such a thing as an appropriate response to grief for psychiatrists that you're looking for when you're analyzing someone?
No, I wouldn't say that there's any single pattern. Now, actually, one of the reasons Susan Smith was one of the most hated women in America, and 76% of the American public wanted to see her executed, was that she did cry on television when she talked about her child being kidnapped and begged that the child be returned. And she sucked in a lot of the public with her fake tears, And that made it kind of her crime even more unforgivable.
But when you go in to talk to someone, you can see a wide variety of different ways of seeing grief in human beings who've suffered a tremendous loss that they haven't caused themselves.
That's right. There's a wide variety. But again, the public has certain expectations, even though it's quite individualized. For example, someone might react just by being numb upon learning the loss of a child, others with extreme tears. So there's quite a range.
Now, you teach also at the law school, and I'm curious what your thoughts are about the legal standard for sanity and in terms of when somebody is declared sane to stand trial and when they're declared not sane to stand trial, that they cannot assist in their own defense. Do you think that standard is a fair one, and is that something that you support? Or if you had a magic wand, would you make certain changes in terms of that definition of legal insanity versus legal sanity?
Okay, again, I just want to distinguish competence to stand
Being able
trial,
to stand trial, yeah.
which is not controversial, from insanity of who is found not guilty by reason of insanity. And the standard in most American jurisdictions is that a person has to be so mentally ill they don't know the wrongfulness of what they're doing. And that's relatively non-confidential. 16 states in the United States add an inability to refrain, or what's sometimes called the irresistible impulse. That's more controversial, and it is a much more gray, ambiguous standard whether someone could refrain. Whereas on the issue of wrongfulness, one can use common sense. If someone wipes away their fingerprints, washes off their blood, throws the murder weapon in a river, it's pretty obvious that they knew what they did was wrong. And that's much a cleaner, easier to reach standard for both psychiatrists and for juries.
And what do you feel that standard in terms of a juvenile should be shifted at all? Both versions of that standard, the one in the 16 states, do you think that there should be a different standard when you're talking about juveniles?
First of all, in juvenile court, the goal of juvenile court is treatment and rehabilitation rather than punishment. So insanity is quite rarely raised. Now, if a juvenile is tried as an adult and they're facing the possibility even of life in prison, then they may raise an insanity standard. But in that case, I don't think it's wrong to use the same standard as an adult. But in juvenile court, it's rarely raised because the judge is theoretically trying to do what's best for the child. And if that means hospitalization rather than incarceration, that's what gets done.
I was actually referring to juveniles being tried as adults, which is a more and more common phenomenon in this country. And so you answered my question, but it wasn't exactly clear, but I appreciate the response. And now finally, I wanted to ask you about evaluating the homegrown terrorist like a Timothy McVeigh, who was responsible for, in part, for the Oklahoma bombings. And if there is some sort of common mental disease or defect where people grow up in this country and end up turning the violence against their own country, and what your takeaway was from somebody like Timothy McVeigh, because I think we all like to sit here and think that the terrorist threat comes from people that don't share our values or don't share our common experience of growing up as Americans. So the fact that you actually evaluated him, I found really interesting, and I wonder what the takeaway was from that experience for you.
Sure. Let me talk a little bit more about domestic terrorists. And when I'm talking about them, there was a recent study done by an FBI agent who looked at what are called lone wolf domestic terrorists. And of the 10 in the study, I personally had an opportunity to be involved in 4 of the cases. And they involved the Oklahoma bomber, the Unabomber, and some of these were anti-abortion individuals. Some were white supremacist. Some were anti-government and technology. And the common features in these domestic terrorists was kind of a warrior mentality. They often felt rejected by society. And I'll just give you one vignette about Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber. When Theodore Kaczynski was in high school, he was very, very smart, an IQ about 165, entered Harvard at age 16, and he skipped 2 grades. Now, he was socially awkward. He had what we call today an autism spectrum disorder. He couldn't read common cues. So now he was not only socially awkward, but he was with classmates who were 2 years his senior. And he wrote a poignant story in his autobiography that he was sitting at a cafeteria table. Young guys and gals. And a guy said to the gal, are you alone? Going to the dance Saturday night? And the gal said, yes, I am. And the guy said, who are you going with? And the gal said, Ted. And the guy pointed over to Ted Kaczynski and said, you're going to the dance with Ted Kaczynski? And the girl said, don't be ridiculous. I'm going with Ted so-and-so. So Theodore Kaczynski heard this. It confirmed that he was on the absolute bottom of the social pecking order. And he resolved in his mind at that time to get revenge against a rejecting society. And of course, he did carry that out ultimately. But that's an example of how many of these mass murderers will feel rejected and anger at society broadly.
Well, I have one final question to ask you about, and I know we're sort of run out of time, but I couldn't really let you leave without asking you about the current state of mental health programs and mental health care in the United States. There has been some talk about the fact that the Navy shipyard mass shooter had been known to be hearing voices, and that under current law they weren't able to put him on a 24-hour hold or a 48-hour hold because he didn't threaten anyone specifically. He wasn't threatening anyone's lives, and that years ago, perhaps under old law that no longer exists, they would have been able to prevent the disaster, or at least to diagnose him properly as being homicidal. I'm just curious if you think that the changes in the mental health law are giving rise to some of these mass shooters, people that we would have caught at another time in our history, because usually the focus is on gun control. But I wanted to just ask you, since you're an expert again, about whether you think that that is a big part of the problem.
Well, first of all, as I understand it, the Navy Yard shooter did hear voices. It was known to the police. It was he acted paranoid and bizarrely in his hotel. But when he did have contacts with the VA hospital, he complained only of insomnia, and the hallucinations were not picked up. But to get to your broader question, it is true that beginning around 1970, there was a shift in the criteria for hospitalization. This was part of a civil rights movement, and the shift was someone simply being in need of treatment to a dangerousness standard, which made it more difficult to get people into the hospital. The other major societal force going on was deinstitutionalization, closing of state hospitals with the advent of new antipsychotic medications. The upshot of that is that there were 2 forces: one economic, to try and treat people in the community, and the other legal. And that means that there are many more mentally ill on the streets today They make up more than a third of homeless individuals. And many of these individuals, including some who are dangerous, don't easily get into the hospital. It's very difficult to get into a psychiatric hospital today, both due to third-party payers and state hospitals also want to allow in only the most dangerous. And so that is a phenomenon which does lead to the possibility of more people not being admitted and committing serious crimes.
Well, I'm afraid that we're out of time, and I had a whole bunch of other things to ask you, so hopefully you'll be able to join us again. I want to thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. It's a big honor for us to have you on Crime Time. And thank you for educating us. Hopefully that all of our audience, all of you guys are going to go away a little bit smarter than before Dr. Resnick came on. So thank you very much. And I'm going to say goodbye to I'm going to say goodbye to our audience, and we will see you next time on Crime Time.
All right. Right. Oh, so you were set up for it out there?